Before this day was over, the water between the island of Salamis and the coast of Attica would run red, choked with broken oars and drowning men in heavy armor, and the king watching from the mountain would see his own brother-in-law butchered in the surf below him. But to understand how the most powerful navy on earth sailed into a trap it should have seen coming, we have to go back 3 days to a single lie whispered into the wrong ear on purpose. Welcome back to Veil of History. History remembers the victors. We remember everything else. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a fractured, outnumbered alliance of Greek city-states used geography, desperation, and one perfectly timed piece of disinformation to break the back of the Persian Empire in a single afternoon. And why the man who built that empire never fully recovered from watching it happen. What would you do if the survival of everything you loved depended on convincing your enemy to trust a lie? By late summer of 480 BCE, Greece was already broken. Xerxes had crossed the Hellespont on a bridge of lashed-together ships, leading a force so vast that ancient writers claimed it drank rivers dry. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and their allies had bought the rest of Greece a handful of days with their lives, and it had not been enough. The pass fell. The road south lay open. Athens, the city that had humiliated Persia at Marathon a decade earlier, stood defenseless in the invaders' path. Xerxes did not show mercy to the city that had embarrassed his father. Athens was burned. The Acropolis, sacred heart of the city, was put to the torch. Refugees streamed onto ships and into the hills, watching smoke rise over everything they had built. For most of Greece, the war already looked over. Persia's army was too large, its resources too deep, its momentum too complete. The only question left seemed to be how much of Greece would survive as ash. Xerxes had not gathered this force casually. Ancient accounts describe a fleet drawn from every corner of the empire. Phoenician galleys prized for their speed. Egyptian ships built heavier for ramming. Ionian Greek crews serving under Persian command because their own cities had already submitted. This was not simply an army marching against Greece. It was the accumulated naval power of the known world, assembled under a single royal banner, meant to end centuries of Greek defiance in one campaign season. That kind of force does not get stopped by unity alone, and unity was the one thing the Greeks did not have. City-states that had spent generations at war with each other, Athens and Aegina, Sparta and half the Peloponnese, were now expected to row into battle side by side, trusting commanders they had recently considered enemies. Sparta held nominal command of the combined fleet, a concession Athens accepted only because no one would follow an Athenian admiral, even though Athens had supplied the largest single contingent of ships. The alliance was less a partnership than a truce, and truces built on mutual desperation tend to fracture exactly when the pressure is highest. Some commanders wanted to abandon Salamis entirely and consolidate the fleet near Corinth, closer to home, closer to their own families. Others feared that scattering the alliance now, after everything already lost, would mean Persia mopping up each city-state's ships one by one, in open water, with no narrow terrain left to level the odds. The debate was not academic. Real fleets, real crews, and the last unburned Greek city all hung on which argument won the room. And for several tense days, no one was certain it would be Themistocles. But the Athenians had not surrendered their fleet. Under the command of a shrewd, ambitious statesman named Themistocles, nearly the entire population of Athens had been evacuated by sea in the days before the city fell. Women, children, the elderly, all crammed onto triremes and merchant ships, carried to the island of Salamis and the shores of the Peloponnese. It was one of the largest emergency evacuations in the ancient world. and it meant Athens still had a navy, even with no city left to defend. That fleet, combined with ships from Corinth, Aegina, Sparta, and a dozen smaller states, gathered in the narrow strait between Salamis and the mainland. Roughly 370 Greek ships against a Persian armada that may have numbered over 800. On paper, it was already finished. In the war council tents, Greek commanders argued through the night. Many wanted to retreat further south, to the Isthmus of Corinth, and make a final stand on land where their hoplites could fight on ground they understood. Themistocles disagreed violently. If the fleet scattered to open water, he argued, Persia's numbers and superior seamanship would annihilate them ship by ship. Their only chance was to force a battle in a space too tight for Persia's advantages to matter. He was overruled. The council voted to withdraw, and that is when Themistocles did something almost unthinkable. He decided to make the decision for them by lying to the enemy. Themistocles owned a household slave named Cyzicenus, a tutor to his children, whom he trusted completely. Under cover of darkness, he sent Cyzicenus across the water to the Persian camp with a message for Xerxes himself. The message claimed that the Greek alliance was collapsing from within, that the fleet intended to flee that very night, and that if Xerxes moved now, he could trap and destroy the entire Greek navy in one stroke. As a favor, supposedly, from a secret Greek sympathizer. It was a lie built entirely out of truth. The Greeks really were arguing about retreat. The fear in their camp was real. Cyzicenus simply handed Persia the version of events that would make Xerxes do exactly what Themistocles needed him to do. And Xerxes, confident, eager to end the campaign in a single decisive blow, believed it. That night, the Persian fleet moved. Ships slid quietly around Salamis to seal both ends of the strait, blocking any Greek retreat. Xerxes ordered troops landed on the small island of Sataleia, positioned to finish off any Greek sailors who tried to swim ashore. Rowers who had already put in a full day's work were kept at their oars through the night, holding position in the dark, exhausted before the battle had even started. Everything was arranged for a massacre. The trap, from the Persian side, looked flawless. What Xerxes didn't understand yet was that he wasn't closing a trap. He was walking into one, exhausting his own crews before a single ram had struck a single hull. At dawn, the Greeks discovered their exit sealed. For men who had spent the night arguing about retreat, there was now, suddenly, no argument left to have. The only way out was through. As the sun rose, Persian ships began pushing into the strait, a channel barely 1.5 miles wide in places, with jagged coastline and shifting currents that Greek captains had sailed their entire lives, and Persian captains had never seen before. The Greek fleet formed a line and waited, allowing the Persian vanguard to funnel deep into the narrow water before engaging. It was a deliberate trap of their own, built on the same instinct that had shaped Thermopylae: force a numerically superior enemy into a space where numbers stop mattering. As more and more Persian ships crowded into the strait behind their leading vessels, the sheer size of Xerxes' fleet became its own worst enemy. Ships that could maneuver freely in open water found themselves jammed hull to hull, unable to turn, unable to retreat, unable even to properly row. Greek captains had chosen this water on purpose. The strait's narrow mouth, its hidden currents, and the way the coastline funneled ships into a bottleneck were all details Athenian and Aeginetan crews had grown up sailing around, details no chart could teach a Phoenician or Egyptian pilot overnight. Themistocles had gambled everything on the idea that terrain could substitute for missing ships, and as the Persian vanguard pressed deeper into water, it did not understand that gamble started to look less like desperation and more like design. Greek triremes, lighter and better handled in these waters, drove their bronze rams into the exposed flanks of Persian ships that had nowhere to go. Persian vessels backed into each other, oars shattering, hulls splintering. Panic spread faster than any tactic could. Soldiers in heavy Persian armor who went into the water rarely came back out of it. Greek marines, wearing far less, could swim clear of the wreckage and fight another hour. Herodotus records that Xerxes' own brother-in-law, Ariamenes, died in the chaos, and that the king watched much of the slaughter unfold from his mountainside seat, close enough to see faces, close enough to recognize commanders drowning in the wreckage of ships he had personally commissioned. The throne built for a victory celebration became a front-row seat to humiliation, broadcast for every scribe and courtier standing beside him to witness in real time. Among the few Persian commanders who fought with any distinction that day was Artemisia, queen of Halicarnassus, who had argued against the battle entirely and been overruled just as Themistocles once was on the Greek side. Except no one on the Persian side had a Sisinus to change the outcome. When her own ship was cornered, she reportedly rammed a friendly vessel to convince pursuing Greeks she was one of them, and escaped in the confusion. Xerxes, watching from above, apparently mistook the wreck for an enemy kill and praised her for it, never realizing his own ally had gone down beneath his queen's ram. It was, in miniature, the entire battle. A Persian force so densely packed and poorly coordinated that it could no longer tell friend from enemy, ally from casualty. By the time the fighting slowed, somewhere between 200 and 300 Persian ships had been sunk, captured, or wrecked beyond use. Greek losses were a fraction of that. The largest fleet ever assembled by a single empire had been gutted in an afternoon. In water, most of its captains had never sailed before that morning. Xerxes did not stay to finish the campaign. Within days, fearing the Greeks might sail north and cut off his only bridge home across the Hellespont, he began withdrawing the bulk of his forces back toward Asia. The same crossing he had built at staggering cost less than a year earlier, meant as a monument to unstoppable conquest, now a lifeline for a retreating king. He left a land army behind under his general Mardonius to finish the war the following year. But the man who had built a throne to watch his own triumph left Greece having watched, instead, the unraveling of his empire's aura of invincibility. The war did not end at Salamis. Mardonius wintered his forces in Thessaly, still confident that Persian land power could accomplish what the fleet had failed to do, and the following summer he marched south again to force a decision on ground of his own choosing. But the psychological damage of Salamis proved permanent. An empire that had spent a generation being described as unstoppable had just watched its own king abandon his own war, and Greek city-states that had wavered on the edge of surrendering now had proof that Persia could be broken. The confidence built in that narrow strait would carry directly into the following year, when the remaining Persian army met its own reckoning on the plains near Plataea, a battle for another video, born directly out of the wreckage still floating in the waters off Salamis. The irony writes itself into the geography. Xerxes chose the vantage point at Salamis specifically, so nothing would obstruct his view of victory. Every historian who has studied that mountainside throne has arrived at the same quiet observation. He got exactly the unobstructed view he asked for. He simply never imagined what it would show him. That's the story of Salamis, the battle where the world's largest fleet sailed into a trap built from a single well-placed lie and lost everything in water too narrow to fight in and too dangerous to escape from. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to Veil of History, where history remembers the victors, and we remember everything else. Let me know in the comments which battle you want uncovered next. Until then, stay in the dark.